Well, maybe for you, they're a roommate that stole something from you, and you confronted them. It was very obvious, it was very clear they stole from you, and they just flat out denied it. Or maybe it was a classmate, maybe their classmate that bullied you relentlessly, time and time again, until you got to a place where you were just begging that you would be invisible. Maybe for you, it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend who lied to you and then lied about you to others. Maybe they're a colleague or a business partner that let some bitterness kind of seep into your relationship unbeknownst to you, and then just one day, years later, it blew up and blindsided you. Or maybe they were your spouse, who you loved and you trusted, and who ended up betraying that trust. The question is, who is your enemy? Who's your enemy? Like, if they were in the room right now, you would just politely excuse yourself and leave. You see them on the street, you get on the other side of the street and you avoid them at all costs, right? You unfriend them, you unfollow them, you block them, you want nothing to do with them in your life. Just the thought of them causes your heart rate to rise. Who is your enemy? For me, it's my father. When most of my life, my father chose to be absent from me most of my life. And at 16, he died of a heart attack. And for most of my life, because of his choice to just be so distant and absent, I thought something was wrong with me. Like I was unlovable, like I had to do something, I had to perform to try and get his attention. And by junior high, after, all these little kid ways of trying to do that, I was pretty bitter. I was an angry little junior higher. And I remember one night, just confronting him. Like my anger just boiled over, and through hot tears, I just started yelling at him and screaming at him. And strangely, this man who I didn't know very well, who was extremely distant, he was not cold or distant any longer. He got up and he took off his belt. And I remember him starting to pursue me, to hit me with his belt, until my mom intervened. And my mom intervened, and she spared me those blows. But as I cowered under some furniture in my bedroom, the damage had been done. Who is it for you? Who is your enemy? Who is your enemy? Jesus has some things to say to us who choose to follow him about our enemies. He has some things to say about our enemies. And I want us to look at that right now, to these words of Jesus. He has something to say to you and to me right now. In Luke chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you." Jesus says, love your enemies. Okay, now if you're hearing this the way I am, immediately I start pumping the brakes, right? It's like, are you serious? Like, is God really saying that I am supposed to love my enemies, right? Is this what God is really like? Does he say we have to love people who've hurt us, who have betrayed us, who have taken from us, who humiliate us, who offend us? Is that even ethical of Jesus to teach this? I thought he was a good teacher, and he is telling me to love my enemies. And if that's your response, I want to assure you, you are not alone. In the first century, Jesus was speaking to Romans and to Jews who would have immediately pushed back on Jesus' teaching. This would have split the room as they listened to Jesus speak. Why? Well, because the Romans were pagan. And when somebody harmed a Roman, when somebody was an enemy to a Roman, they went to one of their many gods, and they actually went to a specific god. They went to the god of vengeance. They would actually pray down vengeance vengeance on their enemies, okay? The Romans had no concept for loving your enemies. No way. You do vengeance. You go to that temple and you pray to and you sacrifice to the God of vengeance. Wipe my enemy out. The Romans had no concept of loving their enemies. They would have pushed back on this. And the Jews, when they heard this, they would have immediately thought about a context where they would have been hurt by somebody. And what was instinctive to a Jew was to go back to Exodus 21. This is where God, through Moses, gave the people the laws. Exodus 21 has this idea, this law of the retaliation. And basically what God was doing through Moses is he was saying, this is how to be a society. This is how to live together in a whole and healthy and beautiful way, to have harmony with one another. But these laws that were given were misused. These were the laws in Exodus 21. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, blood for blood. If somebody's harmed you, the way the Jews interpreted this was harm them back, do vengeance back to them. But what the people had misunderstood is that God gave these laws of vengeance, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, blood for blood, to restrict vengeance, not to require vengeance. The people misused this law. You know, for me, I'm just thinking of context because of my kids, where how this plays out. One will, say they pinch the other. And they're like, ow, you just pained me, right? You just pinched me. I get to pinch you back. And they'll be like, okay, all right, fine, pinch me back. And do they ever pinch with the same amount of pain? No, right? It's pain plus interest. And this is what Jesus is responding to both audiences, but especially Exodus 21, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The idea here is the laws were supposed to restrict vengeance, but instead the Jewish folks were using it to require vengeance. Pain plus interest. Vengeance. Get back at my enemies. And Jesus is calling those of us in the room who are Christ followers, who've chosen to follow him, to a different response. We don't do vengeance. We don't do violence. We don't do pain plus interest. In the face of our enemies, Jesus says, you and me, we do love. We love our enemies. And I got to tell you, like week 1, right into this new series about the words of Jesus, and I'm like, really? We got to start here? Like this is where we're starting? We're just gas pedal down, 0 to 100 miles an hour. I think if this isn't the hardest teaching, it's got to be one of the hardest teachings of Jesus to follow. Why? Because it feels wrong. It just feels unethical to love folks who have hurt us. You might be asking the question, why would God tell me to love somebody who's hurt me so much? And I would tell you that God, in part, one of the main reasons God is telling you to love your enemies is because of his great love for you. There's pain in your life and God sees it. It breaks his heart. But the only way to release you from your pain towards your future, towards your healing, is to learn to love your enemies. And so I want us to tease out of Jesus' words right here. What does it really mean to love our enemies? What does it mean to love our enemies? Theologian Dallas Willard, he defines love as to will the highest good for another. When we love somebody, we will the highest good for them. We want the best for them. We make sure that we do the best for them. And Jesus uses several words here to describe what he's actually talking about, this idea of willing the highest good. He says, do good to your enemies. Like physically do what's best for them. And then he says, bless your enemies. That has to do with your speech. Like you use your words in such a way that it's towards their highest good, towards their best. And then he even says, pray for your enemies. In other words, like in every way possible, in every aspect of who you are, will the highest good, will the best for your enemies. And then he begins to tease out some practical examples of what this looks like. I want us to take just one example of that found in verse 9 here. Jesus says, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. This is a famous passage, and I want to explain what Jesus is saying by first saying what Jesus is not saying, okay? Jesus is not saying that abuse is okay. Jesus is not saying it's okay for somebody to abuse you. Okay, if you've been abused, if you're in an abusive context now, Jesus is not saying that it's okay to be abused. He's in fact, if we go from cover to cover of the Bible, you would find just the opposite. Abuse is not okay. It is not God's desire for you to be in an abusive context. And if you're in a space that is abusive right now, as your pastor, as your friend, I would just say, find one of us pastors, and let us know. Let us help you move somewhere safe to get out of that context and to move towards some healing, get you some resources that you need, okay? Jesus is not saying abuse is okay. In fact, if you really do need that help, I want you to know that there's some men in this room that are on my speed dial, and they will, in an instant, help you move out. They'll show up, and they'll do the work of helping you move to somewhere else. If that's you, I just want to say it. I want to overstate it. Jesus is not saying stay in an abusive relationship, okay? What is Jesus saying? What's he teaching? Jesus is teaching us what love actually looks like when someone hurts us. And there's some things through each of these examples. We're just going to look at this one for getting slapped on the cheek and turning the other cheek. Well, he's going to tell us what love looks like when someone hurts us, how we are to respond. And the first thing that Jesus is telling us in this is that we're actually to confront the evil that's been done to us. Okay, let me explain. The slap that Jesus is talking about is actually a backhanded slap. It's not a punch. This is not done to really wound somebody. It's done to humiliate them. It's done to embarrass them in a public place, to dehumanize them. And Jesus says, when somebody has hurt you, as a Christ follower, confront it. In other words, stand your ground, right? Don't accept the label. Don't accept the dehumanization that's happening to you and walk away and sulk in it and receive it. Stand your ground, confront, look them eye to eye. And then he says the next thing, but don't repay evil with evil. Romans says, overcome evil with good. The idea here is that you turn the other cheek, right? This is not pain plus interest. This is not, oh yeah, you backhanded me, well, here comes a fist. Right? Confront the evil, but do not repay evil with evil. In other words, as I turn my cheek, I release you from what I really am feeling, right? I'm releasing you from this debt, this choice to want to punch you back. I forgive. Confront the evil, don't repay the evil with evil, instead forgive. That's what Jesus teaches us through all of these examples. What does it mean to be a Christ follower? Well, in part, it means that we learn to be like Christ. We learn to love our enemies, not because God is cruel to us, but because he loves us. And he knows that the way to help us release us from the pain and the suffering and the wrongdoing of our past to the healing that's in our future is to love our enemies, okay? So I want to talk to you about some steps, some real practical steps that you and I can take to love our enemies. And these are going to be taken from a book called Enemies of the Heart. And if they're helpful to you, I would encourage you to go buy that book. It's from Andy Stanley, Enemies of the Heart. And the very first step that I'd suggest to you is to identify who you're angry with. Identify who you're absolutely angry with, right? Jesus confronts evil. If you read the Gospels, he doesn't put on blinders. I know so many Christians like, how are you doing this week? And it's like, oh, I'm good. I don't have any enemies. I don't have any struggles, right? Somebody cuts them off. They're like, bless you. I'm like, no, Jesus, identify who you're angry with. But then immediately determine what they owe you. Okay, identify who you're angry with, and that's not enough. Then you got to actually do the work of figuring out what it is specifically that they owe you, that they've taken from you, specifically how they've hurt you. And a lot of us are afraid to do this step, to get very specific. And if that's you, here's what I would encourage you on. Okay, generic forgiveness doesn't heal specific hurts. Generic forgiveness, oh yeah, it's okay. Generic forgiveness doesn't heal specific hurts, you got to be specific in determining what they owe you. Or another way you could say it is you cannot forgive what you haven't clearly identified. Does that make sense? You cannot forgive what you haven't spent time to clearly identify. And so you got to do the work to sit down and actually maybe journal out or talk through with somebody trusted. Man, this is who I'm angry with. This is the hurt that's happened. And then this is specifically the pains that they have caused in my life. For me, I've went through some counseling, some work, some healing with my father. And it was so funny to me as I sat with the therapist in their office, and I would say, like, I would take like a small risk at this. I would say, like, he did this. And my whole life I've been kind of built up to perform, so I would shove that stuff down. And I was a Christian. I'd be up here and I would sing a song and I would tell you, like, there's power. God has power. He's a way maker. He can do it. He can overcome. But in those moments I was like so terrified to actually just say what had been done to me. Almost like I didn't believe that the power of God was greater, the power of the gospel, his grace was somehow bigger than what I'd experienced, the pain of my life. You got to identify and determine what they owe you. Okay? And now here's the real hard step. Then you got to cancel the debt. You got to actually cancel the debt. You got to forgive it. Now, if you're me, you're asking the question, but is it wrong to want to be paid back, right? Is it wrong to want things to be made right? Absolutely not. No, it's right to be hurt, to want things to be made right. But in most cases, being paid back is impossible. In most cases, it's impossible to be reimbursed for what has been taken, right? How do you get back years of neglect? How do you get that paid back? How do you get years back of being loyal to somebody who somehow was disloyal to you? How do you get years back? It's impossible. It's impossible to be reimbursed for what is taken. And God knows that. He knows that the only way to really release the pain of this debt in your life is for you to move towards forgiveness, to move you towards healing, to move you towards your future. And for me, for a long time, I misunderstood that. I didn't understand biblical forgiveness. You see, biblical forgiveness, the Bible's understanding of forgiveness, the words that are always used in the Bible to talk about grace, about forgiveness, they always talk about forgiveness as a gift. It's not what's fair. If you're trying to do an equation like, well, how much is fair to forgive? Where's that line where the hurt's like fair and then from here it's unforgivable? That is not a gospel biblical understanding of what it means to forgive. In the Bible, whenever we talk about forgiving someone of their debt, it's talked about as a gift. Another way I misunderstood forgiveness for years, and I still struggle with this, forgiveness in the Bible is always referred to as a choice, not a feeling. It's a choice of my mind. It's a choice of my will. In a moment, I choose to forgive. It's not a feeling. Okay? We live in a culture, if there's one thing, regardless of our ethnicity, our religion, our personal values and beliefs, if there's one thing we ascribe to together as a community and as a culture, it's my feelings. A culture of authenticity. You do you. Do whatever feels right to you. I'll do me, whatever feels right to me. And if that's you, and if that's me, if we are driven and led by our feelings, we will never choose to forgive. Why? Because it never feels right to forgive. Jesus is speaking right into my culture and into your culture, into our lives, and he's saying, man, forgiveness is never a feeling. It's a choice. It's a choice to release somebody from what they owe you, what they've taken from you. It's not fair, it's a gift. And when you choose to do this in a moment, I want to encourage you to just kind of pray something simple. There's nothing magic here, but just pray something like this. When you've done the work of identifying who's hurt you, identifying specifically the pain, how it adds up, and then you actually forgive him, I would say something like this. Father, God, this is only going to happen through you. I need your help. Father, I choose to forgive, and then put their name in there. Make it very specific. I choose to forgive John. I choose to forgive Sue. I cancel John's debt. I cancel Sue's debt. And then say, John doesn't owe me anymore. Okay, Sue doesn't owe me anymore. Whoever this is, okay? And then this is the last step. You cancel the debt, and then the last thing you do is you dismiss the case. You dismiss the case. Daily, you make the decision to not reopen the case. This is so hard for me, okay? This is hard work. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. And so the memories are going to bubble up. The memories and the feelings are going to flood up. And I would say acknowledge them. Go ahead and face them. We have the Psalms. David is completely transparent in what he's feeling. It's okay. God's grace is big enough. But instead of reopening the case, imagining what I would do to them, what I would say to them, instead of doing all of that, instead of reopening the case, you just simply pray again. Bob, I release you. I've made that choice. Sue, I've released you. The feelings come again. John, I release you. I forgive you. It's going to be tempting to gauge how you're doing with this whole forgiveness thing. Like, have I done it? Basically on how you feel towards your enemy. And what I want to assure you is that feelings are not an accurate gauge, okay? You have to remember the action you've taken, the choice you've made, and eventually feelings will follow that action. They will catch up. They will. I promise you. From my personal life, they will catch up to the action you've taken. As a pastor, whenever I talk to someone who's hesitant to forgive, a lot of the times the person is hesitant to forgive because they're considering their forgiveness in light of what's been done to them instead of what's been done for them. Okay, I'll think about forgiving Andy based on what's been done to me and if I think it's fair or not, rather than what's been done for me. And as a Christian, I don't get to choose to forgive because the other person deserves it. I choose to forgive because I've been forgiven. Man, we are such a culture of outrage, aren't we? Somebody cuts you off and immediately, vengeance, right? Somebody at the light, they're on their cell phone and they're distracted and the light turns green and you honk and they go and then you get up there and it turns red. Vengeance, right? This is way more minor than what we're talking about, but a spouse leaves a LaCroix can, an empty one, on the counter after they drank it. And it's like the 3,000th time that they've done it, so my wife tells me. And it's vengeance. Right? Paul says it this way. If you're a Christ follower, this is what Paul says to you and me in Colossians. Paul says, forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. So many of us consider how we respond to our enemies based on what they've done to us rather than what has been done for us. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I want you to say it with me. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Yeah, say it one more time. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. As Christians, we choose to forgive not because it's fair, not because somebody deserves it, not because I'm feeling it. I forgive because I've been forgiven. This is what Jesus has done for us. This is the great gospel story, the power of the gospel of God's forgiveness in our story, in our lives. In Romans, it says that while we're still enemies of God, you and I breaking the Father's heart, choosing to do life the way we want to do it, our way, wreaking real havoc in our own relationships with others and with the Father, he sent his son Jesus and he took our payment upon himself. He freed us from our sin. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Forgiveness is absolutely the power of the gospel. It's not just something that we receive. It's not just something that's supposed to flow to us, but something that's supposed to flow through us to those around us. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Man, I can't speak for you, but when I think about my life and I add up the way that I've lived in my life, the sins of omission, the times that I should have spoken up on somebody else's behalf, the times I was blind or just disregarded somebody's need, the time I should have been more generous with my resources. Actually, I omitted, I held that back, what I should have given to somebody else, to a brother or a sister. The time I drove past somebody who really needed me to stop and to share what God has given me. When I think about my sins, the sins of omission or the sins of commission, the sins where I committed, there's something I shouldn't have done, where I used my words to tear down the people I love in my life, the times I've lusted, the times I've envied, I've broken the heart of the Father. And his response has been to forgive me through Jesus Christ. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Who am I to withhold when I've been given so much? How do we forgive something that we don't want to forgive? Forgive as the Lord forgave you. How do we forgive something that is or just feels unforgivable? Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And I hope that as I'm sharing this, you're not hearing like, man, forgiveness is so easy. Just do these things. I get it. This is tough. Man, a couple chapters later, Jesus revisits this with his disciples, and he's like, hey, if somebody hurts you, if they come to you in the day and they hurt you, and they just like, oh man, you are just in real pain, here's what I want you to do. Ready? Forgive them. And then if they come to you again in the day and they've hurt you, forgive them. And then if they come to you again in the day, forgive them, forgive them, forgive them 7 times. Just can you imagine that in your life? If somebody just did something absolutely painful in your life in the morning, you forgive them, and then by lunch they did it again. Maybe you are better than me. Maybe you give them 2 or 3 times of forgiveness, but 7, way late into the evening, 7 times. And Jesus' disciples, I love the honesty of Scripture. Jesus' disciples, they hear Jesus say, forgive up to 7 times. Like, just you are to follow me. You're to love your enemies. Jesus says, forgive as I forgave you. And his disciples say this, Jesus, give us faith. Like, this is hard. Like, this is impossible. Like, who does that? It takes real faith to forgive. You know what's easy? It's easy to be bitter. It's easy to nurture a grudge. It's easy to hold on to that grudge. It's easy to rehearse time after time. This is what I would say. If I had them in the room, this is what I would do. It's easy to live in bitterness. It's easy to let that take hold of your life and just constantly just take you down to a place that's just broken, that's just so identified with your pain. It's easy to be there. It's hard to forgive. It takes faith to forgive. Forgive as the Lord forgave us. A woman shared with me that she was married to a man for 20-something years who physically abused her and her children. She's a believer now, and she said one day she just heard kind of like a voice just say, you don't have to stay under this. And so she said, I made a great choice. I chose to not stay under that anymore. I left. And I said, I don't have to stay under this, and I don't ever have to be married again, right? Because that context was so hurtful. So she moved on from that. For 10 years or so, God did some healing in her life, and eventually she got to a place where she said, you know what, Andy, the best decision I made wasn't to just leave this man who was so hurtful to me and to my kids. There was a day where I chose to forgive him. And in that moment, I wasn't simply forgiving him of his debt. I wasn't simply freeing him from his debt. That day, I was free too. I was freed from being tethered and tied and chained down to the pain of my past, and I began to be healed and move towards my future. And then she started to share with me this guy, he started pursuing me and bothering me, and I just kept saying no. For years and years, I didn't want to have anything to do with him, and eventually, as there was healing in her life, God actually gave her a new future. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I want to invite you to go ahead and bow your heads. It takes real faith to forgive. I want to ask you again what I asked you at the beginning. Who's your enemy? Is it that roommate, that classmate, that boyfriend, that girlfriend, that business partner, a spouse, a family member? Who is your enemy? Who came to mind for you? This is what Jesus would say to you if you are choosing to follow him. He's saying there's life in me. Follow me. Here's what he's saying. Forgive them. Release them from the debt that they owe you. Forgive them as I have forgiven you. There is life. There is healing as you learn to love your enemies. May it be so. Forgive as God has forgiven you.